Hello, and welcome back to the HR Leadership Forum, Trends, Talent Analytics, and Change Management. My name is Eric Wallace with Argyle. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we'll address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. We have Stephanie Neal, Director of the Center for Analytics and Behavioral Research at DDI. We're excited to have Stephanie for her thought leadership presentation titled Driving Engagement and Retention, 4 Leadership Trends to Look Out for in 2023. Welcome, Stephanie. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Eric. Thank you for the introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be joining you today and to share some powerful data from DDI's Global Leadership Forecast that highlights some of the challenges in leadership over the past 2 years, and that also provides some perspective not only on the challenges that leaders are facing right now, but also the opportunities for impact as we look ahead to the coming year and to the future of the workplace. And to give you some background on the data that I'll be sharing today, it comes from DDI's Global Leadership Forecast series, the largest and longest running global study of leadership of its kind. This year marked 10 years of us doing this research, which it's the 10th study, which marks over 20 years of us doing this research. And it really has been exciting to be a part of this study because so much has changed in the last 2 years. The trends that we've uncovered come from nearly 14,000 leaders and 1,800 HR professionals from all around the world who provided their perspectives on all kinds of critical issues and what's changed, which really allowed us to dig in to see what's changing and why, and also how it's going to impact the workplace in a number of ways. With so much change over the past couple of years in particular, we know that the job of a leader has become much harder, and leaders are really facing new challenges with their teams that a lot of people can't give as much guidance about. Leaders have been able to see ahead, and they really need to lead with vision, especially at the front lines, where early managers are often stepping up into more strategic roles than they've had to before. And at the same time, they're also being asked to lead more holistically, focusing on the engagement and the well-being of their teams, and helping their team members to find purpose and meaning in their work. And in many cases, we know that pay for leadership isn't as much of an incentive as it used to be. So we're seeing some big changes for what attracts people to leadership roles and also what can push them away that may be able to be met better by improved leadership experiences. And what we're seeing and hearing from leaders is that what was a rising concern about driving engagement and retention in their teams, especially of critical talent for the future, has really heightened to almost a panic moment that they don't feel they have the tools and resources to be prepared for. Engagement and retention, though it's always been crucial, has risen to the forefront over the last 2 years, and it's clear that leaders are feeling the fallout and the pressure to keep their teams engaged. We asked leaders to single out the most important priorities for their organizations out of a whole host of priorities, and engaging employees stood out far and away as the number one most critical priority that leaders say their company needs to pay attention to. You can just look at the next priority down on this list here, which is driving profitable growth, and that's 20% lower in terms of the percentage of leaders who selected it as a top priority. So still something critical, but clearly engaging employees is standing out. And this isn't just a concern for leaders' teams. We also see it with leaders themselves, and they're struggling with their own engagement. Only half of leaders globally reported being very engaged in their roles, and even fewer are finding their jobs full of meaning and purpose. Only about 44%, as you can see here. And in talking with leaders at different organizations about this, we're really seeing that part of the driving force behind these results is that many leaders are being promoted that don't want to be people leaders. They may want the promotion as a sign of growth and success, and likely for some pay increase. However, the additional unwanted responsibilities that are coming with this people leadership really puts them at risk of disengagement. And this is, of course, adding to the retention risk that leaders are already aware of. but really feeling unprepared for. We saw that fewer than 1/3 of leaders who responded to our current forecast feel that they're very effective at retaining talent. This signals both a problem and also an opportunity to provide the tools and support that leaders need, and especially to new leaders who may not have the experience or knowledge for how to look out for retention risk in their teams, being the first time that they're managing people. They probably also don't know how to drive retention conversations. And it's with that in mind, thinking about what leaders need to be prepared for, that we really sought out to discover what are those areas and top challenges that leaders feel they have and that they really need to better retain and engage their people. And as we looked across all the companies and industries in this forecast, what we found is that 4 areas are becoming even more critical as priorities for leaders to guide their success. And this is really where they say they need the most help. Burnout is the first one, and it's also the most pressing concern that we saw emerge through the pandemic that continues to rise as a challenge for leaders to manage, both personally and in their teams. The trouble is that burnout, which we saw really peak at high levels in May of 2020, is still on the rise. Even more leaders are indicating that they're burning out today, and this is especially in the US. The Great Resignation and all the changes in the workplace that we know resulted from the pandemic have clearly taken a toll on leaders, and leaders are really at the forefront in dealing with those challenges. They also bear the increased burden of bringing on new employees, upskilling them, keeping teams and employees engaged and productive, whether that's in person, remote, or hybrid, which we know has some big implications, and we'll see in some of the next sections too. But it's not just their own burnout that has leaders concerned, but really that of their teams, and they're seeing that, and that's of course in that retention risk too. Of all the management challenges that we asked leaders to rate how confident they feel, it was preventing employee burnout that really was the one they're least prepared to tackle. Only 15% of leaders say they felt prepared to prevent employee burnout. And you can see again, this is out of a list of a whole bunch of different challenges. And this signals, of course, that they say they need help, especially amidst a drive towards ensuring their teams are productive right now. In some places, a push back to the office or to making sure that people are being productive if they're not in the office, and those leaders knowing that they can be measured by that. This is, of course, coming up in our forecast as we simultaneously hear stories from senior leaders and CEOs who are really concerned about that productivity kind of paranoia. And where they're concerned, especially when those teams are dispersed or hybrid, that their work isn't very visible. So there's that increasing pressure to bring people back to the office. And that's really feeding into a crisis of trust. And this was really another area that leaders called out to as a falling, concerning low area right now. We know that trust is important, and it's, of course, really essential to build strong relationships. At work, we know that trust helps to build connections with peers and managers and can even influence perceptions of the organizations we work for. So places where we see trust gets broken, those are some of the workplaces that people most likely don't want to work for. And nowhere is trust more visible or needed than at the top. We asked leaders if they trusted their senior leaders and their direct managers to do what is right. And the results are really surprising. And this is one of the areas that I was most surprised to see this forecast, because only 32% of leaders said that they definitely trust their senior leaders to do what is right. This is a really low number compared to the things that we've seen over the years of the forecast. That's less than a third. And although there seems to be more trust in direct managers, which is good, it's still less than half who definitely feel they can trust their managers to do what is right. Because we know that there are more opportunities for direct managers to build trust with their employees, they have a closer and more ongoing connection, and they have more conversations with their immediate employees than senior leaders may have. We wanted to dig into this measure of trust a little bit more and look at a different measure to better understand what's really going on here. And what we found is that no matter how we look at it, senior leaders aren't building a high level of trust, according to leaders that report into them. We asked leaders how frequently their direct managers maintain high trust and confidentiality. So the chart here shows the percentages of leaders who indicated that their direct manager often or almost always maintains high trust and confidentiality. And we found that although a majority of leaders do feel that their manager often or almost always maintains high trust and confidentiality, which is really good, especially with the confidentiality portion, those that report to senior leaders are significantly less likely to say that. And we saw that only 63% of leaders who report into senior level managers are feeling that they're maintaining trust. So that's that bar all the way to the right. This has some, of course, really big implications because there are a lot of negative consequences and risks when leaders don't build trust with their people and at their organizations. We know, sure, most people aren't jumping out of planes like the picture here, this awesome graphic here. They're not jumping out of planes with their managers, but they are entrusting them with career advancement, with their everyday professional livelihoods and their work and their ideas. And we know that when leaders don't build trust and when people don't trust their leaders, they're a lot less likely to bring their best and their novel ideas forward. And they can really hold back innovation that can really prevent innovation and stifle it. And it keeps people from doing their best work. We also know that the main reason that most employees will either stay or leave their jobs is because of their boss. So not building trust means that it's a lot more likely that people will leave. And we know that turnover will increase even more where senior leaders don't build trust. There's a lot of chatter out there about toxic workplaces. I've been reading a lot of articles that talk about it, and trust is a big part of that. We know that leaders need to build trust. We know that it's important for building a positive culture and a positive brand for their companies. And they really need to know that that helps them to be an example, and knowing how to build trust the right way and how to build healthy boundaries with their people is something that organizations can be doing right now. They can be helping leaders to understand that. Trust is something that we know can be very easily broken, but it takes a lot more time to build back, and it's worth that investment in leaders' development to build stronger trust and to make sure we avoid all these kind of pitfalls. As I transition to our next trend, I want to mention that there's a whole lot of buzz and questions out there about hybrid work and how to best design work for leaders and their teams to be successful. But this is really a new frontier for most companies, and there's not as many answers yet in terms of what that best design is. We have some new data that helps to understand just how much of the leadership population is already affected by this and already operating in a hybrid role, as well as how this could be impacting their teams. As part of DDI's forecast research, we found that globally, a majority of leaders are now working remotely or hybrid, with most being hybrid. And this surprised me because there's a lot of workplace data out there, not as much leadership data that really helps to just show what impact this has, what percentage of the leadership population. And this is also true of leaders globally, though we see that globally there are fewer leaders that are working fully remote. Only about 8% of leaders in all regions are fully remote. In the US, there's a much stronger trend towards working remotely, and 22% of leaders say that they're working remotely full-time, along with about 41% working hybrid for a combined total you can see here of 63%. So 63% of the leadership population is now working from home on somewhat of a regular basis. And this is creating challenges for leaders, especially changing how they connect with their teams, how they communicate, how they check in. And we can see that most leaders aren't feeling very confident about this. They're not feeling very confident in their ability to manage hybrid or virtual employees. This was absolutely the lowest rating of any skill that we measured, with only 27% of leaders saying that they're very effective at leading hybrid or virtual teams. We have seen some upward progress in this number over the past couple of years, with more leaders, I think, getting experience working remotely and with virtual teams who hadn't before. That's helped build some confidence. And we see about 7% more leaders say they feel effective at leading hybrid teams and virtual teams than they did in 2020, which was at a low of 20%. So there's been some uptick, but it's still the lowest out of all skills, which means, of course, this is clearly still an area that leaders are going to need some support and development. And really, it can't be taken for granted that they're just going to be able to figure it all out for themselves. They're going to need to refresh and develop their skills at managing dispersed teams to be successful. And this is especially true for leaders who are looking to build their teams and a stronger supply of talent for the future. We know that new generations of employees and really employees who entered the workforce at this time where it was completely remote or working flexibly have started to build expectations about how they should work. And those who were already working in the workforce and had been in person have also adapted to this. So it's a challenging time to reconnect and also to get stability because there has been so much change, so much turnover, and really flux in most teams. And this is, out of this last section of findings, I'll share some data focused on future talent and how leaders feel about being talent builders in this changing environment. First, one of our legacy forecast measures that DDI has tracked over the years of this study is bench strength. And HR's indicated that there's really not much sign of this recovering. Only 12% of organizations say that they have a strong supply of leaders to fill critical roles. This is on par with the record low level that we saw in 2020, as you can see here, down about 30% from 2011. And that was already a fairly low number too, when you think of this is the percentage of companies that say they have a strong bench to fill critical roles. This really reflects that the complexity of leadership has dramatically increased over the past several years, and also that companies are running leaner and it's harder to get that talent and have that good bench of talent to be able to draw on. There are higher demands on leaders, which makes it much harder to build a strong bench, especially at organizations that I said are already running lean and maybe don't have a clear succession pool to draw on. Given the engagement and retention challenge that is huge right now, it's hard to believe that this is going to change dramatically in the next few years or even beyond. So we're really seeing a lot of organizations start to reconsider their approach to talent as they look to the future and thinking about how can they draw on new pools of talent or try to uncover new sources of talent. Now, some of those places are, of course, where there's more flexibility, especially in workforce levels, like not requiring certain credentials that were necessary before, not requiring a bachelor's degree. I know that piece of kind of a buzzword that's out there, the paper ceiling, is really legitimately showing that companies are looking for new ways to find talent and thankfully removing some of the boundaries that existed to getting good, high productive talent that they could have found before. But a big reason that we might be seeing critical shortages still is that leaders themselves don't feel very effective at identifying and developing talent. And this is really a big growing problem that I think a lot of companies are still overlooking, especially because they're thrusting leaders out there to solve the problem of getting in and bringing in new talent in places where there's been a lot of turnover. And this is especially difficult in organizations where there isn't a clear process or approach to succession, and especially if there isn't a good process for internal hiring and internal promotion. So building talent becomes a lot harder for these leaders. We've seen that the percentage of leaders who feel very effective or confident that they can hire, as well as identify and develop the right talent, has dropped over the past few years. You can see here, almost half in 2018, and now we're just over a third in 2022 of leaders feel that they can be very effective at identifying and developing talent. This is probably their second or third lowest area. And this is historically a low area, but seeing that it's trending down from the previous studies is a strong warning signal. Leaders are saying they don't feel they have the tools they need to help build talent, and they're on the cusp of burning out. And in some cases, they're disengaged to the point of quite quitting themselves. So it's really a crisis moment for organizations to support and build up their leaders before they have critical losses. As we've looked into these trends and really reflected on the leadership challenges that are being faced today, it's clear that there's a lot of opportunities to develop and equip leaders. And number one is to involve them in building a positive and stronger culture of leadership. Some of the best ways to do this include showing your leaders you're investing in them. This includes having that open dialogue about what opportunities they may want, making sure development discussions are happening. A lot of people are probably leaving and may continue to leave if they can't see that future path of growth for themselves. And we know that this is a big one, not only for leaders, but also for employees who maybe don't want to go into a leadership track. So they want to see a progress, some sort of progression and a track that they can continue to advance along in a professional track as well, or a technical track. Also, you want to make sure that leaders don't feel isolated and they aren't left isolated when they're learning or developing. So develop leaders together. We know that this is a big one. And in this forecast, we're hearing from leaders that what they want most of all for their development is more meaningful formal learning experiences and development experiences that connect them in learning with others in a cohort with their peers rather than independently. And that's one, I think, that also helps just highlight this time of great reconnection where people are feeling disconnected. So development programs are a great opportunity for doing that. And learning is going to, it's only going to help. Those peer connections are really powerful. And leaders do say they really benefit from learning from others who are going through the same challenges as them. You also want to make sure that no matter what approach you take, that you get buy-in from the top. And this really just makes sense. C-suite and the executives that are going to be setting the tone for other leaders can either energize or really deflate how they feel about the leadership at their organization and the culture of leadership at their organization. You can also help leaders to see themselves and how they can make an impact. So they may need to connect with their own intrinsic motivations to lead, especially those that are maybe feeling challenged in this time where they're not as connected with their teams, and to find meaning and purpose themselves. One way we've seen really work well with this is to provide assessments that give leaders a good dose of self-insight and spark insight by seeing how are they really doing? How are they comparing? Because it's hard to see that when you're in a remote role and you don't know how your peers are handling different challenges. The final one, it's probably a really obvious one that a lot of people miss, is to be human. Leaders should feel supported in learning and being who they are. There's a very strong trend towards personalization and, of course, making sure that learning is relevant. But one of the things that I think leadership programs miss the most is positioning the human element of leadership. So to show leaders that, there's going to be bumps and mistakes that are really natural. There are pitfalls to being in these roles. But it's really a common miss in training programs to just show and over-rely on e-learning and show leaders only that aspirational side of leadership, kind of the ideal, and only tell them everything they should be doing better, which can really be overwhelming, doesn't necessarily help them to connect to how they can do better and see examples of what can go wrong. Leaders need to be able to acknowledge their struggles and to connect with others who not only understand their position, but also help them to apply new behaviors and practice new behaviors that can really help move the needle in all these areas that we've talked about today. Leaders are really at the front lines of all these challenges, and we know that they'll perform and feel better and more engaged with their own roles when they're armed with those right tools and skills to be successful. Thank you all so much for your time today. I know we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to hand this session back to our host, just because I know we may have some time for some questions too.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that insightful presentation.
Thank
Just
you.
as a reminder, people in the audience can still enter questions, and now we're going to review some of the questions that have come through so far. The first is, we've heard a lot about quiet quitting lately, but recently I'm also hearing about quiet firing. Is that actually a thing, or is what people are telling themselves to justify job loss?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Quiet quitting really rapidly became a buzzword that's describing a trend that's not necessarily new. People get disengaged and people are, they are less likely to go above and beyond. So I think that's already been a trend that's there. I think what quiet firing is really referring to is that there are some organizations that are trying to let go of people that aren't as productive. And that's something, again, not necessarily a new trend, but we've seen some dramatic examples out there of companies that do track the kinds of productive behaviors they expect. The problem with that, of course, is you should be very upfront about expectations with your employees. And if there are performance issues or questions, it's something that should be managed through conversations. And of course, to make sure that people really understand there's clear expectations so they can be meeting them. So there's I think with this time where people are a little bit more remote and dispersed, it's kind of bringing out some bad behaviors and kind of allowing those behaviors to be positioned in a way that sounds a little bit more dramatic with those trends too. But that's a great question.
Great, thank you. The next question is there a specific strategy that works best to prevent burnout, sabbatical, remote work, and so on?
There are definitely different strategies to combat burnout. I think the key piece that we're seeing with organizations, it's not so much how do you manage it, but how do you prevent it before you get there? So of course, allowing people to have the balance, the kind of time that they need to be flexible and to manage other life responsibilities is always important. There's a lot of organizations I know that have started to give more mental health hours, more time for people to take time off. But the key is really how to make sure that leaders are part of the connection point for their teams to manage priorities well, to make sure that nobody is getting too much of a workload and not talking about it. So I think one of the biggest probably bad hybrid trends that we're seeing is that employees don't check in as much, or leaders don't check in with their employees as much to hear that there is maybe a problem, that there is too much on their plate. And those, check-ins are really important to help make sure that things are manageable and that nobody's kind of spiraling out or burning out.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what is the best way to create accountability with remote workers?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I will say accountability is always a tough issue because you've now got a situation where clearly the clock was kind of the accountability in the past, the time that people were in the office and out. And now it's got to be clear, what are you really holding people accountable for? Is it their time? Is it the number of hours? Is it the kind of work that they're doing, the kind of results you're expecting? So I think it really depends on the role and what is needed for that person to be successful. And that's the piece that a lot of leaders need help with, I think, too, is having those conversations around what is expected. How do we make sure that we're measuring people against those performance expectations and helping them to be successful by knowing what those goals are and what those kind of key points are that they should be hitting.
Great, thank you. The next question is, do you find that we fail to attract leaders because of the lack of work-life balance?
That's a great one. I think in some roles, that's probably true. Hopefully, though, people that take leadership roles, it's not necessarily that they suddenly don't have as good of a balance so much as that the responsibilities that are being asked of them are fair. So I do think it depends a lot, even by industry. There's, big differences between a leader who's on a manufacturing floor versus a leader that's in an office or at home working remotely and trying to kind of manage that work-life balance. But I think that's a piece of it. And of course, just the responsibilities around managing people right now seems a bit more overwhelming, I think, for some people. And some people are just really upfront and clear. They don't want that responsibility. Others maybe take the leadership role only to find out they weren't ready for this. Whoa, I don't want to be a people leader and don't want to deal with all this. But there's not a clear way to get that kind of perfect preview. And for those that end up in the leadership role, they may not say, what's my exit strategy? How do I get out of this role? So we need to help, make clearer transitions for that for everybody.
Great, thank you. The next question is, why do you think senior level managers are less likely to believe that their managers are trustworthy?
I think that's really interesting. One of the hypotheses that I have just after talking to companies about this is that senior level leaders obviously know what it takes to get to be in a senior level position. So once they have managers that they really rely on and trust, they may just not be as good about checking in and demonstrating to them and building trust with them, even connecting with them because they think they've got this and they're trying to just let them run and execute their results. But to be honest, that the leaders themselves are saying they don't trust that higher level of management, that senior level of management is really an issue. It helps to reveal there's something else going on. And that's something that senior leaders need to be aware of. And we're hoping, by getting some of this data out there, we're going to dig into this a little bit more before we release our main report in early 2023. But we hope that that's going to help provide some good guidance on how to action the data too.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today.
No problem. Thanks for the great questions.
And thank you for an excellent presentation. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today for this excellent thought leadership. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Thanks again.
Thanks so much.